For reading that text for us, and good morning to all. As you are probably aware, we are fast approaching the end of this 14-month long Story of the Bible series. In fact, at this point, we have touched on nearly every book of the Bible from Genesis to Jude, which leaves just one book left for us to cover: the book of Revelation. But when I say the book of Revelation, I could tell there are some of you in there who recoil a little bit, right? Or perhaps you were already recoiling when you heard this passage read about the beast coming out of the sea and the war with the saints, and understandably so. There are a number of reasons that the book of Revelation makes us uncomfortable. For one, it's just a hard book to understand. As any Christian who has tried to read it through once, for the first time at least, knows, it's overwhelming to have these visions happening one after another with bizarre images of angels blowing trumpets and riders on horses and dragons and beasts and bottomless pits. It's hard to make sense of what it means. But perhaps it would be a little easier for us if we knew that all we had to do was pick up the universally agreed upon Christian commentary and open it up and say, well, this means this and that means that. But as many of us are aware, there is widespread disagreement within the Christian community about how to read the book of Revelation. Sometimes it goes to a fundamental level, whether it's talking about the events in the past or the future, or it's just a metaphor for spiritual struggles that we all go through from time to time. And if biblical scholars and Christian leaders can't agree on this, it makes many of us wonder, what hope do we have as just your average Bible readers? And perhaps even that would be tolerable if the stakes weren't so high. Because we know that many people have read the book of Revelation who have come to a particular interpretation of it, maybe saying, I think the beast refers to this person, or I think Jesus' coming is going to happen at this time, that when they have been proven wrong, it's devastating. It's devastating for them, for the people who believed them, who invested time and money and hope and faith in these interpretations, and frankly, for the Christian community in general. So with all this in mind, we might be inclined to just say, you know what? Let's call it quits at Jude. We did pretty well. We made it from Genesis to Jude. That's pretty good. I think we could say we've gone through the Bible. But we really can't afford to do that. I mean, I have said from time to time that some books of the Bible are more significant to the story than others. There are a few books, such as Titus, that we didn't really have a chance to talk about at all in this series. But Revelation cannot be one of them. It is the last book of the Christian Bible, the end of the story, the grand finale to this experience that we've been having for the past 14 months. So it's certainly not something that we should cut. And in addition to this, it's a part of our holy canon of Scripture. And we should remember the words from 2 Timothy that say, all Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. So this claims not only that the book of Revelation is inspired, but that it's useful, it's practical, it's necessary for us to be able to live out the faith as fully as God intends for us to. And that God will make it something that we can grasp, at least at some level, and use. So for those of us who are uncomfortable, I'm going to ask us to try to set some of that aside and give this book, the Bible, a real chance to speak to us. Now, fortunately, there are a couple of tools that can help make this much more manageable. They don't resolve all of the controversies. They don't make it completely easy to understand, but they do make it so that you can get the general message of Revelation at least and be equipped to better read it for yourself. One of those is just understanding what kind of writing it is or what its genre is. Revelation is something called apocalyptic literature. Now, even though this was a unique experience that John had in receiving these visions from God, it was not unique in the sense that God had never spoken to anybody else in this kind of way. In fact, there is a long tradition of God using dreams and images, and specifically using an apocalyptic type of way of speaking and communicating that goes back at least into our Older Testament. We find it especially in the book of Daniel, where we discussed it there, and in other parts of the New Testament. For example, when Jesus gives an apocalyptic vision of the end shortly before he is arrested and crucified and brought back from the dead. And understanding how this works makes a big difference. It's like when you understand the purpose and the basic rules of a sport that you're watching, all of a sudden you can appreciate it more. It's not just a ball bouncing around in some kind of a field or stadium, right? In the same way, when you can understand the purpose and the rules, if you will, of apocalyptic literature, you can make some sense of what's going on. We've covered some of this before, but it's been a while, so let's just touch on this again, right? The word apocalypse itself doesn't actually refer to the future or the end times, but it means uncovering, right? It's about trying to be able to see and understand the spiritual dynamics and forces that are going on behind the scenes. Now, the truth is, there are always spiritual forces at work in our world. Sometimes they are very hard for us to see. Sometimes they are abstract and difficult to name, whether we're talking about things like racism or things like economic crises that are happening, or violence that seems to keep circling in families or in communities. And what God offers in apocalyptic literature is a concrete way of being able to see these forces so we can better understand them. Metaphors are used that gives them a particular form, such as the four horsemen of the apocalypse, for example. This is a well-known part of Revelation that comes in the early part of the book. One of those horsemen, the red horse, is described like this. It says, "And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword." Now, I'm just going to put this out there. I do not believe that there is actually going to be some kind of a figure on a red horse galloping around the world as we know it, like Santa Claus supposedly goes around the world on Christmas Eve, right? I think what this is doing is it's giving us a concrete way to picture something that mystifies us, right? When we read in the news about this kind of conflict that just exists continuously in Israel and Palestine, for example, where war has broken out yet again. And we don't think that the Israelis are bad people, and we don't think the Palestinians are bad people. And we say, how do we describe this? Well, there's a concrete way that Revelation gives us to look at this. There's some kind of a spiritual force that is literally taking peace away from communities and leaving us trapped in these kinds of cycles of violence. Now, I think it's also important to understand that because these are metaphors that help us make sense of these spiritual dynamics, no single metaphor is perfect. None of them captures it absolutely. And that's why in apocalyptic literature, it's common to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different visions that essentially describe the same thing. Now, if you read through the book of Revelation and you assume that it's just telling one continuous story and that each detail is its own unique event, then you end up having a very complex view of reality with a lot of different things to describe. But I'm saying to you that these visions, they're actually overlapping. They're actually describing the same thing using different images and different ways. And it's explicit about this. For example, after concluding the vision of the 7 seals, John's angelic guide says this to him: "You must prophesy again about many peoples and nations and languages." And then it starts over and it gives us a different kind of prophecy that's attempting to describe the events in the same basic way. So maybe this is helpful at one level, but you might think, oh, if it's not even in chronological order, then what are we supposed to do with this? And here's where I would offer a second tool for interpreting the book of Revelation, which is really part of a bigger tool that Mennonite Christians in particular emphasize a lot. Although it might be difficult to make sense of the story Revelation is telling, it is essentially the same story that Jesus told in the Gospels. Now, I made reference to this earlier, that toward the end of his life, Jesus gave a speech, which is sometimes called the Little Apocalypse, in which he laid out all of these different things that would happen. And even though Jesus' speech is also apocalyptic literature, it's a kind that is much simpler and more accessible and more chronological that we can use to have a kind of structure for understanding the end, right? And Jesus's speech can actually be divided into 3 main parts. First, he talks about the beginning of the end. And then after that, he talks about the tribulation as being this kind of time when things really pick up and they get intense. And finally, he describes the coming or the return of Christ at the end of all of this. And I believe that Revelation follows this same basic pattern. It doesn't deviate from it. It zooms in on parts of it. It expands on some of the details, but it works within this same model. Now, I'll say John also adds a kind of prologue and epilogue to the story, where the prologue focuses specifically on Jesus's resurrection as the beginning of the end, and the epilogue speaks about the end of all things, as we find in the chapters that we're going to be discussing next week. But we can use Jesus's teaching as a kind of anchor for keeping us grounded in this book that sometimes is difficult to follow. So with that in mind, I want to take a few moments to actually tell this basic story using some of the language of Revelation. Now, like I said, the story begins with Jesus's resurrection. And in the Gospels, we have a description of the resurrection from the perspective of earth. But in Revelation, we get a kind of a description of the same story from the perspective of spiritual powers and principalities and those dynamics that are so hard for us to understand. This is done by bringing us into this throne room with all of these powerful and mysterious creatures, these spiritual beings, and they are bemoaning the fact that no one can open the scrolls. Now, these scrolls here represent history, God's plan to save the world, the series of events that will eventually lead to reconciliation between God and the world. But these spiritual beings are distressed because we can't seem to get there. No one seems to have the capacity to break the seals and open the scrolls. But then it says this, referring to Jesus, the Lamb who had been slain, it says, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation." In ways that are mysterious and hard for us to fully understand, the Bible asserts that Jesus' resurrection had a kind of cosmic ripple effect, that it was able to open up the final part of history. And that began with the resurrection of Christ. Now, this is actually discussed in a different way in one of the later visions that John describes. And this time it's discussed in terms of the implications that it has for the spiritual forces of evil, right? This is how John describes it. He says, "And a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon," whom the text later identifies with the devil. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. Now, what's this talking about here? Well, it suggests that somehow, although there has been this spiritual struggle between these forces of good and forces of evil that has been going on at least since the fall, Jesus's resurrection tipped the scales, and it made it so that the angels, the forces of good, were able to kick out the forces of evil and ultimately move toward a victory of salvation for God's people and indeed for the world. But while this is good news in the long run, it actually makes things harder for us in the short run, because the text says this: "Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So the time that begins with Jesus' resurrection and goes through the present all the way until the end is described in Revelation as a time of great wrath, when the spiritual forces of evil are upset and are doing everything they can to damage the world, and particularly the people of God, because they know that Jesus is coming. Now, this is pretty intense. And after saying that the Lamb is able to open the scroll, able to open the first seal, the earlier vision in Revelation talks about a series of seals that are opened. And this is where you hear about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. This is where it talks about things like conquest and violence breaking out on earth. But as we read this, we need to keep in mind Jesus's words from Matthew 24. Remember, at the beginning of that speech, he says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." I know that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are typically associated with the end, but I would argue that they are running around on the earth right now, that there are already forces that are causing war and violence and disease and economic oppression and death, that those have been unleashed in a new way since Jesus's resurrection. And for us as Christians, we can see that this is not just misfortune, that there are spiritual forces behind these kinds of things. But although there is this sense that some of this overlaps with history in general, there is a shift in the text when it talks about a specific, more pointed time of persecution. And this is how Jesus describes it. He says, "So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken by the prophet Daniel, at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be." Now, I'm just going to put it out there and admit that this is the part where it gets especially difficult to interpret what Revelation means, right? To figure out when it is that we make this shift, or if there's even a shift between kind of this ongoing, these spiritual forces and realities that affect us through history and this intense time at the end. So when it starts talking about the beast and the mark of the beast, there are people who think that it's referring to a figure in the past. There are people who think that it's referring to a figure in the future. There are people who think it's symbolic for ongoing meanings. That's an important debate, but I'm not going to try to resolve it here. Because for understanding the core of the message, I don't think it really matters. We don't actually have to figure it out, because Jesus tells us about that day and hour, no one knows. Not neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And so if nobody can know the details, then frankly, it doesn't change the way that we act and the way that we respond. We should be prepared, whether the things that we are seeing are just part of the normal process of wars and violence, or whether it marks the near end. And I think it's important for us, though, despite me saying this, to have some sense of what this final evil is like. Revelation describes this kind of final force of evil in these terms. "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names." Now, this is confusing language for those of us who aren't familiar with it. But again, this is where having some training in apocalyptic literature helps. You might remember that we encountered very similar imagery to this back in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, Daniel was prophesying about a variety of empires that would succeed one after another. And each of them were described as beasts coming out of the sea with horns and heads. But Revelation actually gives us a clue that's even more specific, that even goes beyond what the book of Daniel says, when it later says, "I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and on her head was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great." I would contend that the beast that we are talking about here is the force of empire, a force that we have been dealing with in the biblical story at least since the time of the Babylonians, and which has a profound impact on the world that we live in. It shapes our desires, our fears, our reactions. And in this passage, the woman is referring to whatever the particular city is that heads up this empire. Babylon the Great reminds us of this Babylonian empire where this entire tradition began. And I think that this is important for us to know, because it clarifies how Christians are supposed to understand not only these spiritual forces, but also the different nations of the world. You might remember that this has been a point of tension in the Bible story from the beginning. We're told that God loves all the nations and peoples of the world and wants to bless them, and yet they're also presented as antagonists to God's will, peoples who are often working against God's people and God's purposes. But John helps us sort this out in chapter 18 when he writes, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury." This is making a subtle but extraordinarily important distinction here. The nations of the earth are good. The peoples of the earth are good. The kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, this is all a part of God's good creation. But we have all been corrupted by this power of empire, by this force of wanting to have wealth and power over others and a security that is rooted in violence. And when we drink of the cup of that empire, then even though we are good peoples and nations, we end up functioning as agents who are working against the purposes of God. And this way, Revelation is able to take all of these different parts that we are hearing from the story of the Bible and bring it together in the clearest way that we have seen yet. And there's a metaphor that the Bible uses for describing the relationship between God's people and this force of evil that pervades and harms the world. But it's not one that Mennonites are very comfortable with. It is a metaphor of war. There is a war going on between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Now, I say Mennonites aren't comfortable with it because oftentimes you hear various types of pacifists say that we should be trying to avoid using war language and war imagery. And in some cases, I think that makes sense. For example, we use war language too much when we're describing conversation or arguments, and it shapes the way that we think of those conversations as being confrontational instead of productive. So it's not a totally false critique. But on the other hand, I don't think that we as pacifist Christians can give up all. It is a part of human life. It is a part of the human experience, a significant part. War has shaped the world we live in, and in profound ways, it has shaped individual people's lives. However, there are a few things that we can keep in mind that can keep us from using this language without turning into violence. For example, it's important to note that Christians aren't the ones who actually start the war, as Revelation tells us, that the beast was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, right? So if there's this kind of confrontational relationship between the beast and the saints, it's not because we started it. We just happen to be found in it. And I also think it's important to note that Revelation is actually explicit that our role in this is to be nonviolent. We hear this in this kind of cryptic phrase that we had, especially when the text says, "If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed." Do you hear the echoes of Jesus saying, "All who live by the sword will die by the sword" here? This is a call that says that violence, even though it is appealing, is not the answer. That is why it ends with the word that here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So it's a difficult message to be told that we are supposed to engage in this war without using violence. But that's because we ultimately have one who is fighting for us, who will win the battle on our behalf. And in the end, you might be aware that the Bible ends with Jesus in this kind of conquest scene, and undoubtedly it draws from war language that we have been hearing all throughout the Bible story. But I would argue that this is the most pacifist way to use that language as you can possibly imagine. Here is how the text describes that climactic scene. It says, "Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron." One detail that I didn't notice in here in that passage is that it does describe this rider, the white horse, as being covered in blood. But it's not the blood of his enemies, it's his own blood. And although he does come to bring this ongoing, stressful, devastating war to an end, the weapon that he uses is the sword of his mouth, the word of God, a powerful word of judgment and truth that finally brings this devastating conflict to an end. So that's a powerful way of describing the second coming, the final judgment, this last moment. But why do we need this? Why do we need to engage in this kind of futuristic thinking anywhere? Well, I would say because it teaches and trains us as Christians to be aware that there are some really violent, sinister, cruel forces around us, but also to understand who the true enemy is. That there aren't any people or nations that we are fighting against, that this isn't a call to go into physical battle, but as Ephesians puts it, that our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand on that evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. This is a call that is as serious as a call to war, because it's one that could very well cost us our lives. But it is not one that calls us to take up weapons, except for the weapons of truth and salvation and joy and love. Revelation is very explicit that we need to be resisting these powers through nonviolent means, such as speaking the truth and refusing to be complicit with evil, as we heard in the text that was read for us earlier this morning. Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, and so that you do not share in her plagues. May this call help us understand the seriousness of the world that we live in, and commit us doubly and triply to the nonviolent conflict in which we will proclaim the good news until that day when Jesus brings it all to an end.